I am very grateful to be here, and I have been here in this program for 44 years.
Mhm.
And I can't tell you how I'm just as grateful today as I was that day, August 10th, 1981, when I went to my first meeting. And I just knew that's where I was supposed to be. And I just never looked back. I knew this is where I needed to be. I knew this was my tribe. And I'm so grateful that that night it was like I've said this many times over the years, but I feel like when people stood up and they were talking about what they were thinking, what they were feeling, and I thought I was the only one that had those thoughts and feelings. I was so blown away. It felt like to me, I was so stunned. I felt like somebody took a brick and smacked me on the back of the head. Like,
Mhm.
oh my gosh, I woke up. And in those days, if people had like 2 or 3 years of absence, and that was a big deal. It's still a big deal, but now we know people have longer term abstinence. But I just couldn't believe it, when they said, "Oh, I haven't had, any sugar, flour, whatever, for 2 years." And I'm like, wow, that's pretty amazing. So I got a sponsor that night, and without going into a long story of how I got there, this person was a friend of the family, and she's the one that told me about it. I called her and we spoke on the phone for about an hour and a half. In those days, there was no free long distance. And so, so she took me to a meeting that night. And after the meeting, we went to her house and we were sitting in the car. And she said, "What did you think?" And I said, "I feel like I've been on a long journey and I finally come home." And I had no idea it says that in the big book. But that's how it felt to me. And it was just an extraordinary feeling. And so I asked her to be my sponsor that night. And now I will say 5 months into it, and I was a young woman. I was only 28 years old. And I, I lost 40 pounds and, um, and I got kind of, cocky and I wasn't really doing everything I was supposed to do. I was slacking off on going to my meetings and making the phone calls. And this is what happens. This is how people end up there. And so, um, so I had a break and it was really quick. And I remember going to a meeting and my experience was that even though I was in the room with the other people, I felt like I was on the outside looking in, like I was like outside looking through a window at the people. And even though I was in the room with them, that's how disconnected and detached I felt from them because I had, picked up. So so sorry. I was sitting next to somebody who said, and I told her, what that I'd eaten the day before. And so she said, "You better go home and tell your sponsor." And I did. When I went home, I called her. And from that point on, it was, like I said, I never looked back and I never did that again because I realized what I had done. Because, it's so easy to just get caught up in it and get cocky and just say, "Oh my gosh, I lost all the weight. Life is great." But that's why, because we're working the program and so many people, they get to that point and then they're like, "Oh, well, now things are good. Now I can leave." And we can't. This is just a day at a time. And I believe that God designed it that way because it's just a 24-hour reprieve. That's what the literature tells us. And if we came in here and got you know, cured or fixed or whatever, then what would be the need for God? And secondly, who's here for the newcomer? So somebody was here for me and brought me in here. So I need to give back what I've so generously been given. And that's what Thanksgiving is all about. To me, it's like giving thanks, thank you, God, by sharing it with other people. And I'm bound to that for the rest of my life as long as I can keep doing this. And so my whole life, if anyone had ever said to me, "Oh, you're going to be living a spiritual life, and it's going to be based on following God, and you're going to be surrendering food and drugs and alcohol and all this other stuff," I would have thought, What are you talking about?" But that's what happened, and that's not what I was looking for. I came in here to lose weight. I had done different weight loss programs, but I'd never been that overweight. When I was growing up, I was always thin as a kid. And I mean, I still like to eat. My dad was Italian and he was always encouraging it. And, but, then all of a sudden, I just started gaining. And I didn't like that because I wasn't used to being overweight. And then I got really scared because I thought, well, what if I reach 200 pounds or something like that? But thankfully, I started trying these different diets and they all worked once because I didn't have much to take off, 5, 7 pounds, 10. But then if I ever tried them again, it didn't work the second time. And I think that I must have known deep down that, well, this doesn't really work. And so I'd try something else. So I had a journey of I kept trying different things until I got here. And then, like I said, then I knew this was where I was meant to be. And, but it's so much more than losing weight because, yes, that happens. But then what? Then there's life. And so this is what makes it different than anything else because it's not a diet. It helps us to lose the extra weight, but then it teaches us how to live, abstinently. And that's how I look at the tools and the steps. The tools help me to achieve and maintain abstinence, and the steps teach me how to live abstinently. So they work together. I can't use the same behavior after I've become abstinent as I did when I was eating. That's not going to work. So I need to learn a new way of living. And that's where the steps come in. And I've been through many, many step groups over the years and co-led them. And in fact, this was interesting to me anyway. I figured out, okay, 44 years with a minimum of 3 meetings a week. And that's a minimum because there have been many times I've had many more meetings than that in a week, but just for an average, 3 meetings a week, 52 weeks a year times 44 years. That's like 6,800 meetings. So it's really more like 7,000 meetings that I have been to. So how many of those have I shared? Probably most of them. And how many step groups have I been in and co-led? Dozens and dozens, right? But why am I still here? Because we're not cured, because it's just a day at a time. It's just a 24-hour reprieve. And thank God for that, because that's all I can manage. And believe me, sometimes I just, it feels overwhelming. Like, I don't think I can do this today, but I have an incredible support group. And, over the years have built relationships. That's why it's so important for us to do the meetings, to make the phone calls, because then we build relationships and we get to know each other. And when the tough times come, then we're going to turn to that. We're going to call people. We're going to show up at a meeting. We're going to ask God for help because we're used to doing that. If I'm not used to doing that, I'm going to be afraid to do that, and I'm going to be on my own, and that's disaster. Because obviously that's why I ended up here. So, so now I'm 73, and I've lived a lot of life in between, but a lot of life without overeating. Um, a lot of life in all those years, a lot of ups and downs. The big book says those hard to handle highs and lows we all experience, right? So everybody in the world experiences highs and lows because we're human beings. And that's just the way life is going to be. And so if I know that going into it, then I know that, okay, it's a choice. You know, I say this many times, but when people say, oh, the program's hard, and I say, no, program's not hard. Life is hard. And it's how we choose to navigate life. That's the difference. And so I can go through life eating, drinking, drugging, whatever, or I can choose to work this program and have God as my leader, my guide, my director, and then the support of this whole incredible fellowship. And believe me, people have really been there for me, and I like to think I've been there for them too over the years and still do as long as I possibly can. And so, I've had a lot of sadness, but I've also had a lot of joy. I've lost both my parents, I've lost many loved ones, and particularly my husband. And it's almost 2 years now. He died on Christmas Eve, so this is a very difficult time, and it was sudden. But I haven't eaten over it. I haven't wanted to. I just have so much support here. And many people go through lots of difficult things without eating, so it can be done. That's why we're long timers, because we've been doing this a long time without eating, without going back to the food or anything else, just staying with this and understanding that life is hard. And you know what? It's getting harder as I'm getting older because a lot of things change. My health, my body's breaking down. I have, lots of different things going on, but I'm not unusual. I have this conversation with lots of people my age, younger and older, just, or it's either them or their spouses or some family member. And that's the way it is. So I'm just, doing the best I can to cope with all of that. But there's also joy. I experienced a lot of joy too, just, marrying my husband. We were married for 40 years. We were together for 45. So I met him before I came into program, and God bless him, he stayed with me anyway, because that's when I hit my bottom. And he, at first, was a little, he was, I don't know if he was jealous or because maybe I made him my higher power. And now all of a sudden, I've got people in my life and meetings I'm going to and phone calls. And so he was a little resistant, but then he saw how much I changed and he ended up helping other spouses. He talked to them on the phone and say, encourage them. And and then he was my biggest advocate. I worked for the airlines for several years. We got to travel a lot. We had beautiful homes. We moved to Arizona, and we lived there for 15 years. And some of I started meetings out there. That was a huge undertaking, but it all worked out, and I'm so grateful for the being able to do that service. And it was mostly because I was afraid I was going to lose what I had because they didn't have what we had here. And those of you who've been around a long time, you remember the way the meetings used to be here. It'd be like 150 people in a room, and it was dynamic. It was electric. It was exciting, and people just were, so enthusiastic about being in recovery. And like I said, dozens of step groups, closed step groups committed to abstinence. And that was my foundation. And those of us who are long timers, we all kind of grew up together in this. And so, I've learned so much along the way that I like to share. And, people have heard me say some of these things over and over again. I don't care because it needs to be shared, to help one another and to help myself. to remember. And like some things I remember this person saying, I don't remember who it was. It was so long ago, 40 years ago, easily. Um, she said, I don't have to worry about the binge. I don't have to worry about the first bite. Just have to worry about the lie that precedes the first bite. By the time we take the first bite, it's too late. Never mind the binge, right? So I have to worry about that lie that tells me, oh, you can have a little bit more, or you don't have to go to your meeting, or you don't have to make the phone calls, or why do I have to do this? And just don't listen to that. That's the disease talking, and that will lead us down that road. And there's no guarantee we can ever get it back again. And I've seen people take 20 years, 30, 40 years to get this. And I don't have an extra 20, 30, 40 years to waste, and I don't want it anyway. There's nothing there. There's nothing there but a heartache, and in all fairness, it might have worked a long time ago, but then it stopped working. The big book tells us we cross a line. And once we cross the line, if you lose a leg, you don't grow back a new one. That's what it says. There's so much to glean and to learn from the big book. That's why it's so important to read it, and I read it on a daily basis. And I go to my committed meetings and I do extra meetings. That's why I volunteered to speak today. And I do that whenever I can, whenever I can do service by sharing and qualifying on a meeting. Um, making the phone calls, a minimum of 3. I take phone calls. And if I can't take it when somebody calls, they leave me a message, I will get back to them. There was, there have been times, I know this sounds crazy, I've had 21 phone calls in a day. I return them, and sometimes I call people and it's weeks before I hear back, It's like, aren't you making your calls? I mean, I have to make 3 phone calls a day, and in addition to receiving. Now, that doesn't mean you take all those calls and you can't do anything else. You have to manage your time too. But I know that I have to at least put out those calls. And what is that for? It helps me as much as it helps the other person. It helps for me to stay in recovery and to stay in gratitude, for what God has given me. There's so many people out there that have no idea about this program. And then there's so many people that come in here and leave, and I don't know where they go, but I've seen so many people come and go, and probably the majority of people don't stay. So if you're still here, that's a blessing. First of all, it's a blessing that God had someone share this program with us. Secondly, it's a blessing that we're willing to do it, that we're willing to be here, that we're willing to stay. I want to, I'll just sum it up by saying it's, it's a gift. This is a gift. Absence is a gift. This program is a gift from God. And our gift back to God is by working the program and then sharing it and giving other people the hope that we've been given. And there's no better feeling. It's a much better feeling to be giving and sharing my experience, strength, and hope than it ever was to be overeating and indulging in all the other substances and behaviors, toxic and abusive, that I did. That's the thing. When I pick up the food, I'm abusing myself. That's not pleasure. That's pain. That's abuse. We don't have to do it. We have the solution. So, again, happy Thanksgiving. I am so thankful and grateful for this all these years. And I pray that I never go back there, because there's nothing there in the food, just pain. So thank you all, and have a blessed day.